He thought it was just dirt on the glass, until he realized. It was a bloody handprint of a child, begging for help. Arthur stared at the pain, his breath catching in a throat suddenly dry as sandpaper. The morning sun, usually the only welcome visitor in his isolated life in the Appalachian foothills, now acted as a spotlight for the macabre smear. It was small, sickeningly small. The ridges of the palm were pressed flat against the glass, and the fingers trailed downward, leaving long, rust-colored streaks where the owner had slid, weak and desperate, toward the porch floorboards. Arthur dropped his coffee mug. It shattered, sending ceramic shards skittering across the wooden floor, but the sound seemed miles away. All he could hear was the phantom silence of the previous night. The wind had howled through the valley, rattling the shutters, masking whatever whimpers or scratches had clawed at his sanctuary. He had slept. He had slept in his warm flannel sheets, dreaming of nothing, while inches away, separated only by a sheet of glass, a child had been bleeding out. He fumbled with the latch, his hands shaking so violently he nearly tore his fingernail. He threw the door open. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth, indifferent to the horror on the porch. He looked down. There was no body, just a small pool of blood that had begun to congeal, tacky and dark, and a trail of drag marks leading off the porch and into the dense tree line. Arthur was not a hero. He was a retired actuary who had moved to West Virginia to escape the noise of the world, to drink cheap whiskey and read books until his heart gave out. He had no phone line. His truck had a dead battery he'd been meaning to fix for a week. He stood on the precipice of his porch, gripping the railing. The smart thing, the survivalist thing, was to lock the door, barricade the windows, and wait. Whoever had done this might still be out there. But then he looked at the handprint again. It was a left hand. He noticed the pinky finger was shorter than it should be, perhaps previously severed or malformed. The specificity of it broke him. It was not just a mark. It was a person. He turned back inside, bypassing the phone that did not work, and went straight to the gun rack above the mantel. He pulled down the Winchester, 30-30, a relic he barely knew how to maintain but kept loaded out of habit. He shoved a handful of loose shells into his jacket pocket. He stepped off the porch. The trail was messy, chaotic. He saw a boot print near the blood. A large, heavy tread, deep in the mud. It was fresh. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The child had not just crawled away. They had been taken. And Arthur had a choice. Retreat into the illusion of safety or step into the woods that had suddenly turned into a mouth waiting to close. He racked the lever of the rifle, the metallic clack-clack echoing too loudly in the morning quiet, and stepped into the shade of the trees. The forest, usually a place of meditation for Arthur, had transformed into a hostile labyrinth. The canopy overhead was thick, filtering the sunlight into confusing, shifting patterns on the forest floor. He tracked the signs with the amateurish desperation of a man who had read about tracking in books but never practiced it. A broken fern here, a smear of red on a birch trunk there. Arthur's chest burned. He was not fit for this. His boots slipped on slick moss, and sweat stung his eyes. He had been walking for 20 minutes, descending into the darker, damper ravine that cut through the property lines. The silence here was oppressive. No birds sang. No squirrels chattered. It was the silence of a predator's presence. He reached the bottom of the ravine, where the creek bed was mostly dry, just a vein of black mud. There, snagged on a thorny briar bush, was a piece of fabric. Arthur waded through the muck to retrieve it. It was a sleeve, puffy, bright blue nylon, torn violently at the shoulder seam. The inside was wet with blood. He held the sleeve, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was too late. He had to be too late. Crack. The sound was not a branch breaking. It was the supersonic snap of a bullet breaking the sound barrier, followed a fraction of a second later by the boom of a high-powered rifle. Arthur's wool cap was ripped from his head as if by an invisible hand. He did not think. His body simply collapsed, gravity taking over as his legs turned to jelly. He hit the mud hard, the breath driven from his lungs. He scrambled on his belly, rolling behind the thick, rotting trunk of a fallen oak tree. He gasped for air, clutching the Winchester to his chest. Mud filled his mouth. He spat it out, tasting copper and rot. He touched the top of his head. His fingers came back red. A graze. Just an inch lower and his head would have been a canoe. "Arthur!" A voice called out from the ridge above. It was not a scream. It was a shout, casual, almost annoyed. "Stay down, Arthur. You making this messy." Arthur froze. He knew that voice. He tried to reconcile the terror of the moment with the familiarity of the tone. He pressed his cheek into the wet earth, the smell of decaying leaves filling his nose. He was pinned. The ravine walls were steep. To climb out was to expose himself. To stay was to be cornered. He had walked right into the kill box. He looked around desperately for the child. If the shooter was focused on him, maybe the kid was nearby. But the ravine was empty save for the trash of the woods. Stones, bones, and him. He realized then that his pursuit had not gone unnoticed. He had not been hunting. He had been herded. The trail was too easy. The sleeve on the bush was a lure. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut. He was going to die in a ditch miles from anyone who cared, all because he had not locked his door. Leaves crunched. Slow, rhythmic steps. The shooter was not rushing. He was confident. Arthur shifted his grip on the rifle, his sweaty palms sliding on the wood stock. He tried to control his breathing, to stop the wheezing that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. He peered through a gap in the rotting bark of the log. A figure emerged from the rhododendrons on the slope. He was wearing high-end hunting gear, real tree camouflage, waterproof boots, a tactical vest. He held a scoped bolt-action rifle with the ease of a man carrying a briefcase. The man stepped into a shaft of sunlight, and Arthur's stomach turned over. It was Dan. Dan, who lived 3 miles down the gravel road. Dan, who had brought Arthur a cord of seasoned oak last winter when the power went out. Dan, who always waved from his pickup truck and asked about Arthur's sciatica. "Danny!" Arthur croaked, the betrayal hurting more than the gash on his scalp. Dan stopped about 30 yards away. He did not look crazy. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a neighbor checking a fence line. He sighed, adjusting the strap of his rifle. "I told you not to go into the deep woods, Art," Dan said, shaking his head. "I told you just last week. Stick to the trails, Arthur. Dangerous terrain. You did not listen. You shot me," Arthur stammered, pulling himself up slightly, though keeping the log between them. "There was a kid. A handprint." Dan chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Yeah, slippery little bastard. Number 4. He got loose from the holding pen. Ran all the way to your place. I honestly did not think he had the stamina. We were taking bets, you know? I bet on him collapsing at the creek. I lost $50. Arthur felt bile rise in his throat. "Bets? What are you talking about?" "The club, Arthur," Dan said, checking the bolt of his rifle. "Private equity guys, mostly. From D.C. Richmond. They pay a premium for the experience. The isolation. The thrill. West Virginia is great for it. Nobody looks for lost foster kids here. Nobody cares." Dan took a step closer. "But you a problem. We liked having you nearby. It added to the local color. But you saw the product. And now you interrupting the client's hunt." "The client? Up on the ridge." Dan pointed with his chin. "I'm just the guide today, flushing the game, and cleaning up the mess." He raised the rifle, settling the stock against his shoulder. His face went blank, the friendly neighbor mask dissolving into the dead eyes of a shark. "Nothing personal, Art. That's just property management. You a liability now." Arthur realized with a chilling clarity that there was no negotiation. The firewood, the waves, the small talk, it was all just maintenance of the camouflage. Dan was not a neighbor. He was a warden, and Arthur had been living in his zoo. Dan peered through the scope. He was taking his time. He wanted a clean shot to the chest. Arthur was shaking, but his mind suddenly snapped into a cold, crystalline focus. He remembered the wood Dan had brought him. Hard to split. Dan had swung the axe with terrifying precision, never missing the grain. He was arrogant. He was used to stationary targets. He was used to victims who begged or ran. Arthur did not run. He slid. As Dan exhaled to fire, Arthur kicked off the root ball of the fallen tree, sliding backward into the thickest slurry of the creek bed mud. Dan's shot went wide, splintering the log where Arthur's head had been a second before. "Damn it!" Dan muttered, racking the bolt. Arthur did not try to stand. He was an old man. He could not outrun a bullet. But he knew the Winchester. He rolled onto his back, the mud coating his eyes, his mouth, his rifle. He ignored the grit in the mechanism. He aimed not at Dan's chest. Dan was wearing a vest. Arthur had seen the bulk of it, but lower, at the camouflage pants. Dan stepped forward, annoyed, lowering the rifle to see where the old man had gone. "Come on, Art. Do not make me wade in there." Arthur pulled the trigger. The Winchester roared, a cannon blast in the confined ravine. The 30-30 round, designed to take down deer, slammed into Dan's right thigh. It shattered the femur instantly. Dan did not scream at first. He just folded, his leg turning to rubber, and he toppled sideways into the briars. Then the sound came, a high, animalistic shriek of disbelief and agony. He dropped his rifle, clutching his leg as blood began to pump rhythmically, dark and fast, onto the leaves. Arthur scrambled up, racking the lever again. He waded toward Dan, the gun pointed at the man's face. Dan looked up, his face pale, sweat popping out on his forehead. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrified confusion of a god who had just realized he was mortal. "Arthur, wait, wait," Dan gasped, reaching out a bloody hand. "I can pay you. I have... in the safe." Arthur did not speak. He kicked Dan's rifle far into the brush. He looked down at the man who had brought him firewood. "Where is the boy?" Arthur asked. His voice was flat, unrecognizable to his own ears. Up the slope," Dan wheezed, pointing vaguely. "Hollowed-out sycamore." He crawled in. "Please, Art. My artery." Arthur did not help him. He did not apply a tourniquet. He did not offer comfort. He turned his back on the screaming man and climbed the slope. He found the sycamore tree 200 yards up. Inside the hollow trunk, curled into a ball so tight he looked like a discarded pile of clothes, was the boy. He was maybe 10 years old. His feet were shredded ribbons of flesh. He held a jagged rock in his hand, ready to strike. Arthur lowered the rifle slowly. He took off his jacket, showing his empty hands. "It's okay," he whispered. "The bad man is down." The boy did not move. His eyes were wide, vacant with trauma. Arthur gently wrapped the jacket around the shivering child. He picked him up. He weighed nothing, just bones and fear, and began the long walk back. They did not go to the cabin. Arthur knew better now. He hiked perpendicular to the trails, cutting through the roughest terrain to reach the old state highway. Took hours. The boy fell asleep against Arthur's shoulder, or maybe he passed out. When they finally broke through the tree line, the sun was setting. The asphalt of the road looked like salvation. Arthur stood there, exhausted, his head bleeding, his knees shaking. Far down the road, blue lights flashed. A sheriff's cruiser was cruising slowly, scanning the tree line. Arthur's heart leaped. Safety. He took a step forward, ready to wave them down. Then he stopped. He remembered the bumper sticker on the back of Dan's truck. Miller and Sons Construction. And he remembered the sheriff's name. Sheriff Miller. He remembered seeing them at the diner together, laughing, sharing pie. He remembered Dan saying, "Nobody looks for lost foster kids here." The cruiser slowed down as it approached Arthur's driveway, a mile down the road. The driver did not look like he was responding to a call. He looked